Welcome to my channel. In this video we're going to talk about easily read classics. My impression is that many people that starts out reading wants to get to the classics first, but in this video I'm going to talk about why I don't think that's the best idea and give you my suggestions for classics you might start with. I've always wanted to become a reader, and of course this channel is all about my journey to becoming a bookworm, and on that journey I've read a lot of good books and a lot of bad books. And when it comes to classics, my biggest mistake has been to read the most popular books, even though they might have a very difficult language. So my strategy after a while became to find the most easily read classics, and that's a strategy I've been very happy with. Because reading should be all about the fun, so if you don't like dense language, it's not that fun. And before we get into this, if you have recommendations for easily read classics or classics that beginners might enjoy, please comment them below. So we'll start this one off with one of my recent discoveries and a book that caught me off guard. And of course it's a huge classic, it's Hamlet by William Shakespeare. So I thought that this language would be horrible to read, and if I try to read this in English, it is. So that's why I went with the Norwegian translation, and that's a tip. If you want to read classics, you might find the right edition for you, because they have been translated a whole lot of times, and some are easier to read than others. And not necessarily the newest edition, because I've tried reading some books with two different editions, and sometimes the older editions are more easily read. You'll just have to check that out for yourself. Most of you have probably heard about this story, but what surprised me is how action-packed it is and how quickly the action starts. So this is not a big book at all. It's a play, and what do you know? Plays have a lot of acting in it, not that much text. So that makes it very fast-paced and easily read. Also, one surprise when reading this novel is how much humor it is in it. So this is one of the tragedies, but there's a lot of fun. And I actually laughed out loud several times, to my big surprise. I tried reading Macbeth straight after I read this one almost, but I tried reading it in English and that was hopeless. So find an edition you can read for yourself. In general, I think reading plays might be an excellent way of getting into classics for the reasons that I've mentioned. And what better way to start off than with Shakespeare? Who doesn't want to have Shakespeare quotes on the tip of their tongue? I did at least, and I do not regret reading this one. And now for something that might seem a bit counterintuitive. It's one of my all-time favorites, classic novels, and it's The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. So this is the Norwegian edition and it's abridged. It's about 500 pages, whereas the original one is about 1200 pages. I actually didn't know that when I read this one, so you might say that I haven't read the whole thing. But I want to do that someday because this is a magnificent novel. I talked to my sister about this novel and she said that the only thing I know about that novel is that it's huge, and I was like, well, it's not that big, but of course I didn't know that I read a shortened version. So that's a bit sad, but I don't think I would have finished a 1200 page book at that time. This is on the list because it's the perfect revenge story, it's action-packed. It isn't that fast-paced, but it sure feels like it. I've heard people say that it can be a bit confusing because of our main character that likes to dressing up as others, pretending he is not himself. But I was just so engaged with this story that I didn't mind that at all. The pages just flew on by. Also, if you're like me and can't remember names at all, there are a ton of websites out there that provide information about characters in classic novels. So that's a great thing about reading classics. People have said so much about them. So one of my all-time favorite novels, I would say it's easily read, it doesn't have a dense language, and the characters are very, very intriguing, so do recommend this one. The next one is not a fiction, and it might be a kind of a different suggestion, but it's nevertheless a classic. And it's Walden by Henry David Thoreau, and it was first published in 1854. So this is all about the author himself. He travels into the woods to live in a cabin, and here he documents wildlife around him and himself and everything around him, I guess. Being published in 1854, I was very intrigued to learn how things were at that time, and I find that when he decides to go out into the woods and just talk about what's on his mind, I thought that would be an excellent way of getting to know the times. But I do think that he's kind of a special person, because Not that many men at his age would travel into the woods just to live there alone, I guess. In many ways, this book feels like the kind of book that many macho men today tries to write for their male audience. The difference being that he wrote this book for himself, it feels like, and it's just very fascinating. This isn't fast-paced at all. On the contrary, this is very slow-paced, and I spent a whole lot of time going through this, but the language is simple and I found it to be enjoyable, but it took some time. But if you like the concept of a man going into the woods and to live there in the 1800s, this novel is for you. You also feel like you get to know him a bit. He writes these shopping lists where he complains about the price he paid for beans, so that's kind of humorous. I think I forgot to mention it in the intro, but Walden is the name of the place and it's in Massachusetts, so if that means anything to you, now you know. So that's number 3. The next novella is one of those books that's often mentioned when you talk about easily read classics, and I really get why, and that's Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. So this novel feels like reading a children's novel, just with a very serious topic. And that's basically why it's on the list, because we all do want to have easily read novels, and this is exactly that. It's not the longest one, it's surely a classic, and I've read several John Steinbeck novels. I have enjoyed all of them, but this is sort of the go-to novel I find to start with. And I guess many of you might have read this in school. It feels like this would be one of those novels that people, especially in the US, have to go through when getting an education. Since I don't like spoilers myself, I'm not going to go into details with these novels, but let's just say that it's easily read and emotionally damaging. What else can you ask for in a classic? And when we talk about novels that could have been children's novels, we can talk about a novel that is a children's novel, and that's The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. So this one I recently read, and I thought that reading children's novels in general is something I truly enjoy, and I hadn't read a children's novel that was as old as this one, so I thought that would be fun, and it really was. To my big surprise, the story in this novel is not only about Mowgli that's left in the jungle and is picked up by wolves, it's several stories, shorter ones, and that's also one of the reasons why this might be a good way to start. Because if you get tired of one story, you can just skip it and read the next one, so that might be a fun suggestion. But I should warn you that the Mowgli story is probably the one that's best. At least that's how I feel. Of course, being a children's novel, this is also fast-paced, and I'm a bit unsure if this actually is a children's novel or if it's just because of Disney you think about it as a children's novel, because this is pretty dark. And I can't say that I don't enjoy that aspect. Fast-paced novels that's plot-driven with a bit of darkness, it's just intriguing and fun. So this one is also on the recommendation list. And when talking about Rudyard Kipling, it's suddenly very apparent that there's going to be a lot of men on this list. So if you have easily read classics written by women, please comment them below. And in fact, the next novel on this list is the only one written by a woman, and that's Emily Bronte and Wuthering Heights. So I read this a long time ago, but I can still picture the vivid landscapes and the mood it set me in. So it's one of those novels that makes you feel you're really a part of it. You sort of feel like you're sinking into the novel. And it's not a lot of books that I experienced that with, so it's a true mark of quality. I actually discovered this novel through Kate Bush's song, and that's one of the reasons why I suggest reading this. It's not difficult to read and you get a whole lot of cultural references. And that has to be one of the reasons why you want to read classics, to know what all the fuss is about. After I read this novel, I felt it was referenced everywhere, so it may be one of those novels that you read and then feel like it's all around you, which is a plus. And being a classic, this is very much discussed today, and it's not that long ago I read somewhere that people were disgusted by how much abuse was written about in this novel, and that I have to be honest and say that I didn't think about 1 second when I read this one like 15 years ago, but I'm sure that this might be one of those books that if you read it today, it might be a whole lot of different things that you didn't find the first time you read it. And that's also one of the fun things about reading classics. They're so timeless, and many of the themes just appear time and time again, and they just stay relevant. Many of them will have more depth as you read them many years later, and I think that will be the case for this one as well. Also, a novel that I read some time ago is this one, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. It came out in 1886, and this author is famous for wanting to discover the different sides of one's mind, so this is quite psychological, and it's a gothic tale. So what got me to read this novel in the first place is his other novels and how adventurous they all seem. So I think he decided to live his last years in the Pacific Ocean on some island, and that's very fitting with all his books, I feel. I've not read all of them, but I've read some of them, including Treasure Island. So these ones also feel kinda like childish in a way, but maybe that's just because they're exciting, and exciting books are fun. I'm not going to spoil this either. I know that many of you probably know what this book is about, and as with Wuthering Heights, I think this one will also have grown quite a bit from when I read it last time, so maybe I'll revisit him at some point. And now over to something a bit more heavy, and that is Ivan Turgenev and Fathers and Sons. So this I read really recently, and the reason why I have it on this list is basically because it's Russian. I believe people think that Russian authors is a bit heavy. I've read Dostoevsky and some other Russian authors, and they can be a bit much. So when I read this one, I was very happy with how light the story is and how fun the characters are. So this one, Bazarov, is one of the main characters. He's a nihilist, and he just is a very, very polarized character that I enjoyed very much. So a character-driven novel is not something that I often find entertaining, but I really did with this one. Also, if you read it, you can brag about having read one of the Russian greats, and who doesn't like that concept? And lastly, of course, it's short. So there's that. The last novel on this list I considered not having here at all, because I couldn't remember if it was easily read or not, but then I remembered how quickly I read it, and that has to mean that it was. So it's The Great Gatsby by Scott Fitzgerald, or F. Scott Fitzgerald. This came out in 1925, so it's not the newest novel on this list, but it sure feels like it. It's set on Long Island in the Jazz Age, and it feels very modern in how they talk about the physical things and owning things, having a lot of money, and all of those. It's a lot of drama to it, a lot of intrigue, and it's a short novel. It's very popular, and if you read it, you can talk to all of the people that have seen the movie and ask them, have you read the novel? It's so much better. Not that I know, because I haven't watched the movie, but I'm just guessing. Often I feel like if you've read a classic novel that you didn't like, it gives you even more social credit points, because you can talk about how much you disliked a classic novel. And with those wise words, we're rounding this off. If you have further questions, just ask them below. I will be more than happy to answer. I hope you liked this video. Do you have any classics to recommend? Please do it in the comments. And thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, please consider subscribing. I will be talking more about easily accessible reading and books in the future. And have a very pleasant day. Bye!